Hello and welcome everyone to Interrogations Without Coercion. This is a panel webinar put on to be able to talk about how police are actually retraining on interrogations to avoid coercion and avoid false confessions, and what types of legislative efforts are being used to help support that change here in the US. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping matters. If you want to submit a question, please do. Just use the Q&A feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of the window. Please keep your questions topical and appropriate. Anyone posting inappropriate language or content will be removed. We're recording this webinar and we'll post the recording on the Quattrone Center's YouTube channel as soon as we can. And if you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be announced during the event and also popped up as a poll. Write down the codes and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. With that, our first CLE password is truth. So the first CLE password is truth. Okay. So to get started, just a little background. A quarter of people who are wrongly convicted of murder falsely confess to the crime. We know that coercive police tactics lead to these false confessions. Innocent people produce full confessions with details to a crime they know nothing about. But does it have to be that way? Since the 1990s, investigators in the UK and other European countries moved from a confession-oriented approach to using the interview itself to gather evidence. The tactics that are used are based on scientific studies of social and cognitive psychology and human memory. Investigative interviewing depends on rapport building, open-ended questions, not coercion. Since 2009 in the United States, the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, also known as HIG, has yielded over 100 research projects on topics such as social influence tactics, the cognitive interview, and science-based methods of detecting deception. Not only do we know from this scientific, rigorous research that coercion is not needed to interrogate or interview a suspect, it's counterproductive. Non-coercive tactics yield better, more reliable information for law enforcement. But moving the United States into this brave new world will take some dedication and, frankly, a revolutionary culture shift. Our panelists today are part of that shift, both from within police departments and by moving legislatures to pass laws to help improve our interrogation methods. Dr. Andy Griffiths has been instrumental in developing the investigative interviewing used in the UK and now throughout the world. He has worked with departments here in the United States to train detectives and officers in interviews in ways that are respective of the suspect's rights and agency. Matt Jones recently retired from the Tempe, Arizona Police Department. Oops, sorry, lost my place there. In that position, Matt attended training from the HIG and has developed a curriculum that is consistent with that training to be used here in the United States to promote rapport building and cognitive interviewing. He is the co-founder, director, and lead trainer for Evakavi, using verified scientific-based principles to train officers in investigative interviewing, strategic information elicitation, and communication. David Thompson is the president of Wicklanders Alaska and Associates, a private company that provides interview training in the public and private sectors, specializing in non-confrontational interview and interrogation techniques. Over the last few years, Dave has moved the company away from coercive technique training to embrace rapport building and cognitive interviewing. And last but certainly not least, Rebecca Brown is the policy director for the Innocence Project. She has been a driving force in legislation around the country aimed at curtailing deceptive practices in interrogations and improving interview practices to reduce or eliminate false confessions and improve policing. So thank you, everybody. Welcome. I am so glad that you're all with us today, and you can all go ahead and show yourselves for folks who are here. I'm going to ask our folks to please introduce themselves for you, tell us briefly a bit about what they have been doing in this area. I'm going to ask to start with Dr. Griffiths.
Hi, Larissa, and everyone who's listening in. So just to expand on Marissa's introduction, yeah, my background in this is very much as a practitioner, but someone who's also gone and taken academic research training to further my knowledge. So in terms of the United States, as Marissa said, I think there is a cycle here where the US are now happening upon issues that other countries, particularly the United Kingdom, happened upon probably about 40 years ago. And the cycle of change is very similar. So my involvement in this, as far as the US is concerned, is to work with police departments, but also policymakers. False confession is just one of the issues involved in this. And I think you very quickly come to realize that, in actual fact, a lack of skill involved with some officers is just as big an issue. And that stems from the fact that interviewing has always been termed to be a natural skill. And there's now a large body of research that says that's just not the case. And you need to be trained to be skilled as much as in any other complex area. Some people are better at it than naturally, but everyone benefits from training. But also, that isn't sufficient. Change of the type that Marissa's described needs, as she said, transformation. That involves leadership, that involves change in not only legislation, but also department policy. And culture is one of the biggest issues in this area. Police are culturally debt-ridden to confessions as being a gold standard of evidence. And there's now a huge amount of evidence that says that just isn't the case. But they need guidance to move away from that, to know that they can be successful, solve crime, protect the public. And that is something that I can bring to the party, having had 30 years of experience doing it in the UK. So that's really where my work is focused, is in being a practitioner and working with not only detectives and officers, but police leaders as to how they can take these brave steps. And they are brave steps, and countries that have done it before have also found difficulties, but there is a way through, and people need to work together. And that means legislators as well as practitioners. So I do training programs, but always try and involve command and leaders as well as practitioners in that. And I think that's enough from me, Marissa.
Thanks, Andy. Matt?
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Matt Jones, and I am the lead training director for Revicavi. And I got involved in science-based interviewing back around 2014. And what had happened is I started to look at curriculums all across the country that we were teaching to law enforcement and couldn't find any curriculums that were actually supported by research. And that led me to being invited to come out to the high value detainee interrogation group and going through their training over the next 2 years. And it was extremely helpful and allowed me to connect with the researchers that are actually doing the research behind all these fantastic science-based techniques. But what I found, though, from my experience there is that there wasn't a framework that actually took all these techniques and put them into a comprehensive framework to teach the local law enforcement here. And that's where I started to work with the research community to develop a curriculum that is completely science-based and backed by the research, that is filled with techniques that we know are ethical and that we know actually work out in the field. And from that experience, I've continued to work with the researchers on a regular basis in these research projects, and now conduct trainings to federal, local, and state law enforcement investigators all across the country, and also to corporate investigators as well.
Thank you, Matt. Dave, you are next up.
Great, thanks, Marissa, and excited to be here with both Dr. Griffiths and Matt and Rebecca, a good friend. And it's this conversation is exactly what we've really been focused on at Wick Landers-Zalowski the last handful of years, is a collaborative discussion. So the last 40 years since the company had been founded kind of went from a polygraph and investigations company and the way that interviewing was conducted maybe 40 years ago into what we're doing today, which is really primarily focused on the same things that Dr. Griffiths and Matt talk about, is investigative interviewing, is embracing science into practice. And in the last few years, we've not only changed some of our content, but we've publicly rejected some of the concepts that are traditionally out there, specifically in the US. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those tactics here today. But I think what the three of us from a training standpoint all really stand for is we don't expect, the practitioner to be an expert on accessing research papers and analyzing the methodology of qualitative and quantitative research. And we also don't expect the academic community to go sit in the interrogation room and investigate a crime. And as training organizations, kind of like Matt just spoke to, is we feel like we're the conduit between embracing this research, interpreting that to create a platform and a practical application for the practitioner. And kind of conversely is taking practitioner experience and working with folks like Rebecca, Marissa, yourself, and academics to contribute data to research, to create a platform that we can not only mitigate false confessions, but also, as Dr. Griffiths explained, really implement a better culture and better police community trust through all of this collectively.
Thanks, Dave and Rebecca. I know I appreciate that you're joining us, even suffering from a cold, so gold star. But could you just tell us a little bit about the work you're doing?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be with all of you today, and it's been such a pleasure collaborating with all of you through the last couple of years. So I'm the Director of Policy with the Innocence Project, and I'm also honored to work with the network of innocence organizations around the country to forge innocence reform, largely at the state level. While there are some local efforts, and we can talk about that a bit later, most of the work that we focus on is state-based legislation. But, I'm very mindful of what Andy said in his intro about police culture, because legislation will only get you so far. You cannot legislate changes in culture. That has to happen over time. But we're always concerned, with really establishing uniformity across jurisdictions, right? You don't want a state to have some, jurisdictions putting best practices in place and others not, and the level of justice you receive depending on the county that you reside in. So a lot of our work is really trying to make best practices, science-based practices, uniform in state after state. And, the first generation of reforms that we worked on at the Innocence Project and with the Innocence Network was to record custodial interrogations, just to create a record of what transpired in the interrogation room. And obviously, there are many benefits to that that we also could speak about later, but it really is foundational. And the second generation of reforms really led us to kind of turn into the methods employed in the interrogation room. And top of the list for us really was the use of deception during interrogations. It's a feature in nearly all of our DNA-based exonerations at the Innocence Project, and of course, other non-DNA exonerations. And folks, of course, can look at the National Registry of Exonerations to learn more about these cases. But, quite frankly, this became a large focus for us because so many of the exonerated men and women that we've spoken to through the years have spoken about that and just the impact of that and how just absolutely powerless they felt in the interrogation room. And so that has been our focus. Just last year, we're pleased to announce that both the states of Illinois and Oregon banned deception in the interrogation room, but this was only for people under the age of 18. And I do want to stress that perfectly mentally capable adults provide confessions with great frequency. So it is our hope that this will extend into adults as well. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and everybody else. And I want to start, Andy and Matt, with you. Talking about training and what is so different. What is so different about bringing in science, and what kind of science are we talking about for folks who aren't quite as familiar with this? What is different about building a training around scientific methods as opposed to the way we tend to do it in the United States? What's so wrong with how we currently do that? And I'll leave it to Matt and Andy to kind of join in on that.
Shall I go first, Matt?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think let's deal with the big issue really about type of training, and I think this is where we go beyond interviewing, and it's the whole shift towards educating police officers better. And I don't mean making police officers academic. I mean basing training in every area on a solid evidence base, whether it be, any form of investigation or firearms, whatever. So that's the first thing, is it's to make the training not introducing simply a person with X number of years experience, who merely by having that number of years experience is seemingly assumed to be skilled and the best person to train others. So it's putting some professionalization into that training. When we started the training in the UK and took on what was known as advanced interview training for detectives, over 50% of the detectives who turned up for the training failed the assessment center. So in other words, they were asked to do a mock interview at a certain level in order to gain access to more training, and 50% of them failed that test. And that test was simply asking for an adequate, structured interview. So that's a sign that, experience does not correlate necessarily to skill. Conversely, in some of the trainings I've done in the US, including one quite recently, the least experienced person on the course was the most skilled interviewer, because they brought their natural personality to the interview room and maybe weren't influenced by their experience of a number of years of doing it a certain way. So, and there's literature across a lot of social sciences to back up training methods. We're not talking about the techniques now, we're talking about the training methods. So I think that's my first, answer back really, is that it's about, training is about professionalization. And within that professionalization, if there's an evidence base, there are repeatable and consistent skills that can be passed on to people who can use them. Matt.
Thank you, Andy. So first of all, I want to say I completely agree with what Andy mentioned about experience not always rising to the level of the skill level we would expect of investigators that have been on for 10, 20 years. And we see that repeatedly when we run just simple exercises with core competencies of just asking them to interview for 5 minutes without asking leading questions. And we see very quickly how challenging this can be for investigators. But what I will say is very different about the science-based trainings in terms of traditional trainings. The traditional trainings all revolve around customary knowledge about what they have been taught, what they have been learning through the agencies that are not backed by research. And the science-based trainings are just the opposite. We have a lot of research to support the techniques that we are teaching now. But the other challenge too that we see is that the customary knowledge has a lot of overconfidence bias. It has a lot of background that they can focus in on to say that these techniques work. And what we don't have so far yet with the science-based techniques is we don't have this great vault of videos showing how effective they can be throughout the US. And this is one thing that we need to change. And then also we don't have a lot of experienced instructors that can teach these techniques that have actually used them out in the field to show how effective they can be. So this is one of the initial challenges that we're seeing as we are teaching these science-based techniques moving forward.
Just come back quickly on that. Is the other thing to accept, of course, is that you will not always see the result of good interviewing. So what Matt refers to about having a lack of certain types of data is absolutely true. You could do the best interview in the world on a real life case, but if the evidence isn't there, that suspect might still not be charged and might not be convicted. We also need to remember interviewing is not a silver bullet, and that it's part of a case construction. So similarly, you can have a poor interview that could still result in a conviction. So it's important to separate those issues sometimes and look at the technical skills that are definitely supported by the evidence, but also be careful to see that they might not always get you the result at court. We've all seen strange jury decisions, for example. So I think this is one of the difficulties of going from theory to practice, and success is that people could take up the training, faithfully replicate it in a real life interview and still not get a conviction, but they might have done everything right. So we need to be careful to distinguish good technique from just outcome.
Well, I think, Andy, and on that, so it kind of begs the question of what is the goal of the interview? Is it to build toward a conviction? Is it to get investigative information? What's the goal, and how is that different from a more coercive interrogation technique?
So I don't want to dominate, but just to come back quickly on that point, simply, it's more information, but also maybe preventing defenses. On some occasions, an interviewing is about putting questions to someone to commit them to their story, and the evidence might come out further down the track. But it's always about information, but it's sometimes more than obtaining information. It could be about negating information or confirming certain things as well. It's complex, and this is one of the difficulties. Let me hand back to Matt.
Yeah, I was going to say, Matt, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so I would say something similar. I would say not only more information, but especially more accurate information. And that is the challenge here. If we were to change our mindset towards pushing towards a confession, and instead of looking for everything that proves somebody's being deceptive, to something where now I'm trying to prove that this person in front of me is actually innocent, how would that change our question strategies? How would that change the way we are approaching the interview with that different mindset? And I think that's what's important.
And Dave, I want to kind of bring you into this as well. Your company has gone through a very public moving away from a particular type of training toward more non-confrontational, as you say. Can you just walk us through why was that important to you? What was so bad about a confrontational interview if they actually work?
Well, I think, and that's, so what Marissa, what you just said is interesting, and all these points collectively tie together. Even Rebecca speaking to the importance of recording interrogations, right? When you record an interrogation, it helps what Matt and Andy speak to, of removing the goal of just getting a confession, right? Because now we can strategically prepare a series of questions to commit somebody to a story or to an alibi or just to obtain information. And that's all documented and recorded, versus historically of an investigator having a primary goal of, let me just get a confession and who cares what happens from A to Z as long as I end up with Z. And I think that the recording is really important, the transparency of the process, but also reinforces the positive part of just asking open-ended questions and committing to somebody to a story. But back to the question you asked me, why was it important for us to make the change that we made? We've always taught non-confrontational, but one of the methods that we also taught was focused on a confrontational approach that also had an emphasis on behavior analysis. It used some tactics like the false evidence ploy and minimization techniques. And when you start to take the huge collective body of research, not just academic research, but the statistics provided by the Innocence Project, for example, on DNA exonerations, and you look at common denominators to not just false confessions, but to even suppressed confessions of guilty subjects, and you see investigators lied about evidence. Investigators may have minimized consequences or the perception of consequences. They didn't take into consideration the vulnerability of a subject, maybe a minor, maybe somebody who's mentally incapacitated at the time for whatever the cause might be. And so when we did that, our kind of goal now is everything that we teach, similar to what Matt spoke about when he went through Hague training, is how do we know that to be true? So if we're going to claim you should do it this way, or this means this, how do we know that to be true based off of both the practicality of it and the research of it, and kind of falling in line with the Mendez principles, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about here, but following that guideline. And the last thing I'll say, and pass it back, is when we go into departments, is you kind of kick this off with, historically methods that they've used have worked. And we use the term work, that's loosely, right? Worked could mean it has solved cases, but it's also provided wrongful convictions and also minimized the amount of information we can get. So our kind of mantra in some of these departments is if it ain't broke, break it, and have to educate people on what they've done in the past. And one way that we do that is maybe showing a video of just a confession, which and Andy can speak to a lot of research on this, but when jurors just look at a confession that's full of details, intricate details about the crime, it's hard for lay people or judges or juries to differentiate between a true confession or a false confession. And so when you show a confession to investigators and they say that's a good confession, there's a lot of details, this person's clearly guilty and involved, and then you backtrack and you look at what happened in that interview room that led to that confession, and you hear fact feeding, you hear promises of leniency, you hear threats of consequences. And once you realize kind of the recipe that resulted in that end product is when you can understand how these are unreliable and involuntary and oftentimes false. So I think it's that education can be really difficult, but like everybody spoke to so far, it's more of a culture change than just a tactic change.
And we'll talk about the culture shifts that are going to be necessary for that. And I thank you for kind of highlighting that for us, Dave. But I want to kind of circle back a little bit about where Rebecca mentioned that a lot of the current legislative fixes, and that will be a whole part of our discussion, Rebecca, hold on. So I promise I'll get to you. But it's about deception. I mean, deception is not illegal in the United States. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that there's nothing unconstitutional about police lying to suspects about evidence or others. So Matt, I'm going to put you back here. What's wrong with lying? Why is that a problem?
Well, so everything's wrong with lying. First of all, it completely ruins the integrity of our investigation. So especially in the climate that we are facing right now, how do we get up there on the stand and say, well, yeah, I lied here in this part of the investigation, but I'm telling the truth everywhere else in the investigation. So I want you to believe me. And that's one of the problems. The other problem is that lying really enhances the credibility of evidence, especially false evidence. And that's where we see these false evidence ploys coming across. And, when we have subjects in an interview room, they should hopefully think that we are being credible as being members of law enforcement. When we start to lie about evidence, it really enhances the credibility, especially of that evidence. That's what we want to avoid. Bless you. So, this really works against us in the interview room environment because it detracts from our credibility. And once our credibility is shot, it is extremely challenging to try to repair that credibility moving forward. And that's why we want to take lying completely out of it.
And Andy, if you have anything to add to that, please do. But there's a question in the chat I want to kind of bring out about the role of confirmatory bias or other cognitive biases in the interrogation room, and how are your investigative interviewing techniques accounting for that, if they do, and whether there are differences in terms of the suspect's race or gender or socioeconomic background that would have you change an interview strategy, excuse me. I know you don't use the word interrogation, Andy, but how would it change the interview strategy for you?
Yeah, first of all, Matt's covered the issue of lying very well. I won't take up further time by going back to that. I agree with his comments. In terms of confirmation bias, I mentioned this a little bit like this in the introduction, this is one of the problems of seeing interrogation in isolation. And I'd make the point that, I've tried to illuminate this various ways in various lectures, generally badly, but imagine if you've got, a sore leg. You go to maybe a physio who massages the muscle, maybe advises you to rest. And that's fine. Maybe that'll cure the problem. But what if the problem is actually a bad back? And this is the issue with interrogation and the focus on interrogation and confirmation bias, is that interrogation is perhaps a referred pain, a referred problem from a bigger issue, which is the dynamics and construction of investigation. And a lot of that confirmation bias comes from premature identification of a suspect and then a discretionary evidence gathering process that simply strengthens the initial hypothesis. And this is why, for me, interview training, first of all, has got to be broader than suspect interview training, because good witness evidence can really improve your investigation. And then it also links to investigation training, because the whole way in which the investigation is structured is part of that confirmation bias. Other thing about confirmation bias is a lot of it is completely subliminal. And that's where the education comes in, about making investigators aware that this is not a bad thing, it's a natural thing. You've got to physically manage yourself away from it. So again, what I call scaffolding, in other words, providing training all the way across the investigative chain, helps interrogation training. So confirmation bias, we're all liable to it. We've all looked at someone and thought, I'm sure it's him. So it's supporting that to move away from it. Was there another point you wanted me to answer, or I've covered that off?
Well, it's just the question from the chat was about, do interview tactics based with an understanding from social science differ based on the gender or socioeconomic background or race of the suspect who's in front of you?
Well, certainly, I think it's fairly common knowledge that ethnic minorities and Black people in majority white historic countries have suffered with all sorts of bias attributed to nonverbal behavior, which is culturally ignorant and therefore reinforces incorrect identification of behavior as guilt and therefore tactics. So the answer to that is yes. And not so much evidence on gender, to be honest, but again, lack of knowledge can definitely allow urban myths and anecdotes to become fact that increase leaning towards one way or the other.
Right. And so, Matt, that seems to kind of mitigate toward this higher skilled investigator as opposed to one who's relying more on kind of whisper down the lane training. Is that something that you're able to incorporate now with your trainings with departments that you're doing?
If I understand your question, Marissa, are you asking if we are providing advanced training beyond this initial core training?
Well, just in terms of when you're working with a department now, are those issues that Andy just related in terms of dealing with some of the racial insensitivities that may have been historic among a particular department, or even just kind of assumptions that get made, are those things that are being incorporated using a scientifically based training method?
Yeah, so I don't see a lot of issues, at least so far, with racial insensitivities. We are teaching investigators to be curious, and not just curious about the investigation, but we're teaching them to be, more importantly, curious about who is in front of them and what motivates that person. And this curiosity doesn't allow for having stereotypes. That'll work against you here. And if they're truly being curious, they should be exploring this person altogether and looking past, just what they are seeing physically in front of them and getting down to what is really driving this person, whether they were involved in this incident or not. But no, I have not seen a lot of challenges so much with assumptions related to race or gender, more so directly what Andy is talking about with confirmation bias and throughout, and confirmation bias meaning not just at the beginning of the interview, but throughout the life of the interview, and especially beyond that throughout the entire investigation, is something that continues to be a challenge for us as we are teaching just a smaller component of that investigation, which is just the interview.
And Dave, of course, your company works very well in the private sector. In addition to the public sector work that you do, are there similarities between the types of training, or is it very different the way you might train, say, an insurance agency versus law enforcement on those issues?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points I want to make. I just want to go back to what Andy said. I think it's a really important point is when he talked about the kind of the root cause of this confirmation bias goes well beyond just the interview. And we know one of the pathways to false confessions is misclassification. And it's what caused an innocent person to be in that room in the first place. And as we know, a lot of investigators then have a presumption of guilt in that conversation, which is part of the problem. And so I think for all of those that are listening that are looking at, critiquing a confession is to start well before that interview occurred. Was it, eyewitness misidentification, which we know is a leading cause of some of these issues, faulty forensic science. I mean, the hair analysis and bite mark evidence and all this kind of craziness that's caused some issues. And specific to the interview, and what we talked about before is kind of historically this reliance on behavior analysis, where if I scratched my beard and I sneezed at the same time, for some reason that means I'm being deceptive, which creates this confirmation in the investigator that I've got the right guy in the room, which puts them in the position of then all these coercive techniques. So I think sometimes we're too siloed. Like, I like how Andy, I think your explanation was good, Andy, of the massage. But I think that's a good point, is where sometimes we look too much at what happened in the room versus how do we get in the room in the first place. So I think that was a really good point. To your question, yeah, we teach about half of our business is state, local, federal law enforcement agencies. We teach some of our Department of Defense partners, and we also teach in the private sector. One of the major differences I think we see is often in the private sector, the level of evidence is much greater. One thing that I know Andy's spoken about this before, and I think it's a really good point, when we talk about deception, the use of deception, one of the reasons, and this, I'm stealing some of Andy's points here, this is credit citation, Dr. Andy Griffiths, but I've heard him mention that what is the root cause of why an investigator is lying in the first place is because they don't have that evidence. So it's forcing them to come up with this lie. They didn't do a thorough enough investigation. They're kind of filling in that gap. And what we see often in the private sector is before a company will talk to an employee, there's often video surveillance, there's multiple reports. It's a little bit different than a kind of a investigative fact gathering interview. But the same concepts apply in both, right? We're focusing on the same concept of no lying about evidence, don't minimize consequences, don't focus on behavior. Interviewing victims and witnesses need to have their place in the investigation. So it's the same concepts across the board, but I do think that cases have a different level of evidence available to them, generally speaking.
And I want to start kind of shifting over into more of the legislative policy world, but I understand, and we've mentioned this a couple times, that before we get there, or more making it more that universality that Rebecca talked about in her opening comments, is this question of culture. What is it about the U.S. culture in law enforcement that might be obstacles to moving forward? And I'm kind of looking at you, Matt, as the retired police officer, to kind of start that conversation.
Thank you. So I think the obstacle here is really just lack of knowledge and lack of understanding of what is behind the science-based techniques. And also, as I mentioned before, this overconfidence bias that, hey, what we've been doing actually works. Why do we need you to come in here and show us something else? And, the culture has not been something that we have not been able to push through, which is actually very exciting. And one of the best things that we have found that has worked with this is to actually invite the leadership in to come in and sit in the class as the student first, and then allow them to go back to their own agencies and to get everyone talking about how excited they were about the training before we even come in to do any training at that specific department. So that is one of the ways that we've been kind of re-engineering this whole issue with culture and to get around that, to start the training off on the right foot. But the obstacle of culture itself is not going to go away anytime soon. This audience that we are training to is a show me, don't tell me type of audience. They want to see the videos. They want to see the techniques working in real time. And that's why that we do a tremendous amount of practical exercises so that they can get a lot of hands-on practice with this and get used to this. But it's going to take time. And that's something that we've seen with the agencies that are starting to make this transition away from the old techniques to the new techniques. It does take a little bit of time. But we're also finding with this culture is that, and this has really come about in the past year, and I've heard this from federal investigators and state and local as well, they just don't like using the confrontational techniques. And nobody ever thought to ask the investigators, well, do you actually like using these techniques? And we're hearing these comments coming from people with a lot of experience and also with new people, that they just don't like the techniques of confrontation, of using theming tactics and things like that. So we're seeing a lot of good indications that people are ready to start making these transitions.
So Andy, kind of building off a little bit on that, in the trainings that you've done so far in the US and elsewhere around the world, is there this element of when folks attend your training and go through that, but once they get back to the force, kind of well, that's nice for training, but that's not how we do it here. Kind of how do we deal with that kind of pushback that may come from law enforcement itself?
Yeah, it's why one of the first things I mentioned was leadership. I think that so if we go back, so 1992, the UK started. They trained every police officer, 146,000 police officers trained as a response to basically false confessions, and the initial post-training evaluation of that course was great, but that was because the course was full of young officers doing very, very simple crimes. As we got a more mature understanding and a more in-depth evaluation was conducted, the results weren't so good. Hence, we took the training to another level. So, really, I would go so far as to say, being slightly controversial, that it can be wasted dollars. If you stick again, I'm not a fan of this. I'm a personal view. If you get officers from, let's say, 6 different agencies, 2 each, onto a training course, they sit in the room for 2 days. They may get some great training, but how are they going to implement it if they go back and there's 10 detectives who didn't? The culture and the leadership are just as important as the training. Now, the big mistake the UK made was that they did lots and lots of initial training. They didn't do any continuous professional development. And again, there was a feeling that CPD looked like another course. But again, we've matured that. CPD can be coaching. You know, I'm a big motorcycling fan. Valentino Rossi retired on Sunday, best MotoGP rider ever. He had a riding coach until his last race. So that peer-to-peer coaching, viewing interviewing as this dynamic skill that you're never perfect, everyone has a bad day, and it's about incremental improvements once you get the basic skills, is as important as that first course. Now, you're at the stage of first courses for a lot of agencies, and it's great to hear some of what Matt has said about the cultural reboot from leaders. That is vitally important, and it's got to be supported and emphasized.
Right. And I think, Dave, I think you touched on this as well, and Andy, you did in your opening remarks, but the kind of concept that we have training for, you know, how to use tasers and search and seizure updates and all kinds of stuff, but we don't provide in-house training on how to interview people. And Dave, I know Wicklander's trying to fill that void somewhat, but how do we improve that away from the more traditional, shall we say, the techniques that are available in the United States? How do we start to replace that with the better techniques that I'm sorry, Matt, I keep forgetting how to pronounce Evakavi, as well as Wicklander and others that are out there doing it right.
Yeah, I think, and collectively, it sounds like we're all seeing the same concern. As traditionally in the U.S., a interview or interrogation training course was go to a course for 2 days, then all of a sudden you're blessed to go conduct interrogations for the next 30 years. And it's this top down, which Matt just spoke to, which is really important. It's like Dr. Griffith spoke to, it's the continuous training. And I'm going to go back to reinforce this recording, the importance of recording is, and there's a lot of research on this too, is when I conduct an interview, if it's not recorded, my recollection of what happened in that room is not going to be very accurate to what actually happened in that room. So having the ability for self-awareness, self-critique and evaluation of my own interview, as well as having a supervisor or somebody who's more proficient in that to give me critical feedback without having kind of a memorialized record of what I did. What are we providing feedback on? So being able to go back and measure how many open-ended questions did I ask? Did I contaminate that confession? Another good resource I saw in the questions, a lot of people looking for resources, is Jim Trainum, the former homicide detective who wrote the book, How Police Generate False Confessions. And he's got a really simple process of looking at a timeline of when was evidence introduced into this case. Was it from a witness, which could cause a false confession, right? Faulty information. Was it from the subject? Was it from the media? Or was it from the investigator planting these seeds? So all of that to say, how do we make an impact? It's not just a 2 or 3 day course and then cross your fingers. It's this continuous follow-up, evaluation, and hopefully transparency of what is happening in that room going forward.
Great. And that was such a beautiful segue for me into kind of moving toward the policy discussion, Dave. Thank you. But first, I need to tell folks who are getting CLE credit, your second CLE password is empirical research. It is empirical research, which is going up on the poll right now for you. So make sure to write that down. So when you do your form, you can submit that. So Rebecca, we're shifting over to you, my friend. Dave was talking about recording as kind of the first step, if you will. Sometimes we've heard about recording interrogations as a prevention measure for false confessions. That's not fair, I don't think, right? But it's still a first step. Is that how it works?
Sure. I mean, I think, certainly, recording in and of itself is not going to prevent a false confession. I mean, I think certainly one could argue that, if the interrogation is being video recorded and there are techniques that, law enforcement understand to be potentially coercive, right? They might not do that on the tape, right? So it could have a deterrent effect in that sense, right? But I do think, to your larger point, it does not. But it is a foundational reform. It gives you a sense of what transpired in the interrogation room. It takes away the, kind of he said, she said, it's really just sort of provides a solid record of what transpired. And, I'm reminded too of, we just heard mention of Detective Jim Trainum, who has really been an incredible force, in this movement to really try to reform, how we, collect confession evidence. And, and he talked very personally about, a case he had where he was able to review a tape. This was in DC. And by the way, this was before it was a mandate that they record interrogations. Detective Trainum just did it because it was good practice. And he took a confession from an individual who he later learned had an airtight alibi. And he was able to go back to that videotape and view it and realize that he was unintentionally feeding facts to the suspect. And it was fully unintentional. And that was really, obviously, that is the value of recording right there. And I think also you need this recording to move into any of these other reforms. We, for instance, received a call from a lawmaker in your state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, who is, had read a lot about sort of this, new deception ban legislation, wanted to pursue it in Pennsylvania. And I noted you don't record interrogations yet, right? That needs to happen first, or together, but I would not pursue, right, a deception ban without first making sure you're recording interrogation. So it is a critical reform. Now more than half the states mandate it, about 30 plus DC, the federal government does it through policy. So, we're seeing incredible movement in that area.
And I understand that many departments have voluntarily taken that on as well. My hometown of Philadelphia, of course, voluntarily started to record. Do we know how many agencies around the country are recording right now, ballpark?
Maybe one of my co-panelists knows that.
Fair enough. Right.
Probably about 7 years ago, the count had been about 750. That may have risen. It's hard to tell, but look, many law enforcement agencies already recognize the value of this reform, right? In many, many states where we're pushing the reform, we never encounter a state where no agencies are doing it. But are they doing it uniformly? Being on the tape at the right time? All of those things, right, really matter. Legislation is very helpful in terms of creating uniform practice. But I think, in terms of all of the reforms that we promote around the country, I would say, law enforcement reforms, right? Recording of interrogations is something that many embrace. Sometimes there's front-end opposition, but in every place where they've, implemented it, law enforcement come back and say, this was good, this helped us. So, yeah.
How many times has law enforcement said, we're good, we don't need to record anymore, we're going to stop doing that?
It's less about that. I think that it's more about the mandate, right? When you're pursuing legislation, it's not that people necessarily argue with the value of the reform, they argue with the mandate.
And it's the implementation and the cost.
Implementation, cost. There are also, many of these recording of interrogations laws have exceptions to recording, which often, speak directly to those issues law enforcement raise when we're pursuing this legislation, right? And I would argue many of these laws have exceptions that you could drive a truck through, right? Like you really, we are hopeful that we can start minimizing those, right? But there are certain things that, can't be avoided. And so you put in certain exceptions that are allowable. There are certain, like, for instance, if they don't even know at the time that they're doing the recording that, they're dealing with a potentially like a high level crime, right? They might bring someone in on something else and then realize, oh, okay, this is bigger, time to turn on the tape, right? But that wouldn't be an entirely recorded interview. So all this to say, there are many exceptions in these laws. Interestingly, we worked with lawmakers in New York to introduce a law, which is yet to get a hearing. But one of the elements of that proposal would collect data on the types of exceptions law enforcement are, invoking to not record, to see if there are any patterns, right? Like if we saw 80% of confessions not being recorded because of like equipment malfunction, right? That would tell you something about maybe that's not a great exception, right?
Right.
And so those are some of the things that we're trying to do to really better understand even. But, the hope being that you really have minimal exceptions.
Right. And Matt, of course, coming from Tempe, where you did record interrogations, was that ever culturally an issue to accept it? Or was it just kind of, this is how we do things and it's not that difficult or obstreperous to do?
No, I didn't see any pushback for recording here or with other agencies yet. I think if we are thinking of this from the mindset of an investigation overall, when we show up on a scene, everything that we're doing is trying to protect the scene from being contaminated, protect the scene in terms of memorializing everything that's there and everything that's not. The interview is just an extension of that scene. We should be memorializing everything that happens in that interview. And then there's so many benefits to us recording that I find a hard time coming up with a valid excuse as to why we shouldn't record. Now, the cost to implement this is definitely a concern. And some of these agencies just do not have the funding to not only set up a proper recording system, much less creating an evidence sharing platform now that many agencies are migrating to, where all these recordings are saved in the cloud. So this is going to be a challenge for law enforcement, but this is just going to be something else that we're just going to have to adjust to. But this should be the minimum requirement, and it should not be just for suspects. It should be for victims, should be for for eyewitnesses, and especially should be for sources. Any sources that we are coming into contact, those conversations need to be memorialized as well.
And Andy, I want to kind of give Rebecca a little bit of a rest, because I know she's still a little under the weather. But this question about legislating policy for law enforcement, there seems to be sometimes this kind of pushback against, you can't tell me this, we're going to do it our own way, finding kind of creative little loopholes around. Is that what you saw in the UK when you had the major legislation, which came down in 1984, kind of changing culture? Was there that pushback, or did law enforcement kind of realize this is where we should be going?
Yeah, I caused to reflect on this recently when I was writing something. And so just for everyone listening, the UK mandated recording practically from 1986. It came into 6 forces first and then extended to all 43 forces. In actual fact, between 1986 and 1992, when we started the National Interview Training Program, there were some of the worst miscarriages of justice ever. But they were resolved much quicker and highlighted much quicker. So what I'm saying there is that, yeah, some people still tried to proceed the way they'd been proceeding, but they got caught. And so there definitely was pushback. And there were a couple of cases where there was one case, for example, where a young girl was killed. She was mutilated. A vulnerable adult male was arrested. He made no comment for 5 interviews and then confessed when he was basically coerced by the officer in charge of the case, bullied essentially. But what happened was that case went to trial, and whereas they would have got a conviction previously with the confession, and then maybe the appeal court would have thrown it out, the judge threw out the confession. Now, what the detectives in that case, they went to the press and said, this is ridiculous, we can't do our job. But they were in the minority, and very quickly that did. So there was pushback. I'm not painting the UK as a perfect picture at all. But of course, what happened was the data produced from the recording, in the same way that Dave and Matt and Rebecca have all referred to, meant that transparency was much quicker. And you can never put right a miscarriage, but the cases were quashed much quicker. So this is culture again. Why the leadership is so important. When I've had conversations with Rebecca before about law change, this is a two-sided coin, right? You can also give the police investigative powers that balances the situation, and justice is always a balance. So in the UK, again, when I say this to some of my American friends, that they're amazed. In the UK, you can get phone downloads and billing from suspects in serious crime cases from the phone providers within 24 hours. That makes a huge difference to the amount of evidence you're walking into an interview room with. And so, if we're going to get the guilty locked up and keep the innocent out of prison, we need to balance this. At the minute, you need recording, but the police also need proportionate powers to do their job if you're going to take away some of the tactics they think are what solve cases.
Right. And Matt, I don't know if can you speak to that as well in terms of the law enforcement response to being told what to do? And you're muted, my friend.
Sorry about that.
Had to happen once during the webinar, so all good.
All right, I almost made it. So yeah, this is going to be a challenge because each department is going to handle this differently. And I see some departments that will embrace this in terms of accepting these new guidelines. And I do see pushback from other agencies, with the legislation aspect. What I will tell you that I think is really helpful that I have not seen yet, and I apologize to all the prosecutors here today, is I don't see a lot of prosecutors that are getting behind these policies and these guidelines and the pushes for reform. I'm seeing this from the other side of the table and not from the prosecutors. We need the prosecutors to get behind these policies, because as far as the prosecutors will go, law enforcement will follow what they are telling them they want to see. And that's the missing element here, is we're not seeing that push yet.
Thanks. And I want to move this back to the kind of legislative focus and spend a little time, Dave and Rebecca in particular, on the work that you've done in Illinois. And I don't know if people kind of understand that, about how revolutionary that was, but you are trying to ban deception. Like, you are trying to go against the Supreme Court, who says it's just fine, but getting state legislatures instead to say, no, it's not. And I don't know if you could, the two of you can kind of talk a bit about the genesis of that idea. How did that come about? And are other states being receptive? You said Oregon as well. Pennsylvania's reached out. How is that going for you?
Sure. Well, I mean, several states have reached out actually since the news hit around Illinois and Oregon as well. And interestingly, someone who was a huge champion of the effort in Illinois, and by the way, Matt, I do believe this is more of the exception than the rule, but was State's Attorney Kim Foxx, who was a wonderful proponent of this reform, and really pushed it in many ways. For many reasons, of course, false confessions and preventing them, of course, being at the top. But another was that it was a racial justice reform. And I really do want to kind of stress, when you look at 101 false confessions out of Illinois, 91 were people of color, 77 Black men, 14 Latinx folks. So in many ways, this is a racial justice reform. Here in my home state of New York, when I crunched the data, it was 80%. Not faring much better, incredible disparity. And, I think much of this has to do with suspect development and sort of what we were talking about, of like, how we got into the room, right? And those things are likely happening way earlier on, before someone's in an interview or interrogation room. But, quite frankly, this is a racial justice reform, and it is something that, many lawmakers are embracing as a racial justice reform, including in Illinois. But I think, to be frank, right, there was a little pushback. I think that certainly when we talked about, leading with a reform that would include everyone, including adults, that was just not something that there was openness to. And I think in many ways too, it was the first out of the gate, right? It was the first state trying this. It was a very, it was an intense reform. And I think that it was certainly something that, lawmakers knew was going to get pushed back. It would really revolutionize, what takes place in the interview room. And what's so fascinating was, so quickly after that law passed, many of the lawmakers in Illinois came back to us and said, look, we want to at least make this consistent with brain science, which we had talked to them about, and have this cover people 25 and under. That said, the hope still is that we'll expand to adults. Here in New York State, we had a bill that is now been in the State House for a number of, I think now 3 years, it's our third session we're going into, and it has not received a committee hearing. Now, this is a bill that would expand the mandate to adults. But interestingly, I think another aspect of that proposal really did receive some pushback, a lot of pushback, which was the notion of basically during the pretrial hearing, right, where you're assessing voluntariness, which is the only thing that confessions are assessed for before they're admitted. We wanted to include in that same hearing reliability, like look at the reliability of this evidence. And that bill has not moved forward. But I will say, separate and apart from legislation, because we did talk about prosecutors' offices, and there's nothing stopping them from doing this, can say, we are not going to move forward with confession evidence that was based on deception. We're not going to do it because that evidence lacks integrity. And, that is something else that certainly modern prosecutors' offices can implement tomorrow. That said, it is obviously great to have uniform practice across the state, and that is best achieved through legislation. But I will really say that in both states, I think the reform did not receive a ton of pushback. And I think a lot of that was because of who the messengers were. In Illinois, I talked about State's Attorney Fox being such a champion. In the state of Oregon, the bill sponsor was himself former law enforcement. So he understood just how important this reform was. And he, of course, could speak for law enforcement. So I'll end there. But I mean, I have to say we are receiving requests from around the country to pursue more of this legislation.
And Dave, you obviously were instrumental in getting that work done in Illinois as well. How did you perceive that the involvement of you yourself or Wicklander-Zalowski is kind of adding support to that effort?
Sure, and Rebecca shouldn't undersell herself. They got bipartisan support in both of these states, which is right. Pretty incredible, and that's due to the work of Rebecca and her colleagues. And I think it was to the question for me is embracing law enforcement's input on legislation versus just mandating something, and understanding. I like what Andy spoke to before is justice is a balance, right? And so if there's a perception that we're taking away a tactic, we then need to provide training on what else to do, because I would say, and at least my experience, a majority of these investigators are well-intended, and they're going and conducting interviews or interrogations based off of how they've been trained for the last 70 years. And so when you take away a technique that they were trained on how to use, you have to replace that with something else. And so I know in our training, when we kind of advocated to departments of what we're doing and who we're training, they gave us feedback on, okay, well, what can we do instead? How can we do this better?
Right.
We're requesting training, and legislators approached me at the bill signing asking, how can we help get funding for more training? So that's the trade-off. If we're going to tell them what they were doing was wrong, how can we provide something to do what's right in the future?
And what do you see as kind of the next, is this where legislators should be looking to make major reforms in terms of how we interrogate suspects or interview suspects? Should we be focusing in on these fragile populations, or should we really be pushing more for a blanket deception ban?
I'll let Rebecca speak to their priorities of legislation in a second. I think that just for me, legislating, I know what the UK did is it's incredible to have a framework that this is what we're all going to do. I don't know if we'll ever get there in the United States, but I do think at least looking at these tactics of let's get rid of lying about evidence, lying about consequences. Let's record everything. Let's take special consideration for juveniles. Let's make sure the advisement of Miranda is done differently with the vulnerable population. Let's make sure trauma suspects, witnesses, and victims, that there's specialized interviewers to handle those cases. So I think legislatively, it might be hard to mandate, here's a method A to Z of what has to be used. Would be great. I don't know if we'll get there, but I think looking at specific tactics and measurables for that is probably easier. But Rebecca can speak to their priorities much better than I could.
No, Dave, I mean, I think you actually really just hit on something too with training, because, there was a bill in California this year that was I believe it was near unanimous support from lawmakers, unfortunately vetoed by Governor Newsom, which would have directed the Commission on Peace Officers Standards and Training, so the post that does the training, to have interrogation methods that are ethical, science-based interviewing techniques. That was word from the legislation, and it obviously moved forward. There was a lot of support for it. Governor Newsom vetoed it on fiscal grounds. He said that there was not, the general fund would suffer. However, he said, but I am directing posts to still create this training. And I would just say, just how critical training is, and how much support there should be for that from lawmakers. I think it should not, but I'm sorry, Matt, I see your hand up and I wanted to, did you have something on California?
Yes. I'll just share with you, Rebecca, that that whole topic is not dead. I am very fortunately on the working group committee out there for that, not the legislation, but for the training itself. And I can just tell you that it is not dead, and that there are still a lot of things moving forward. So we'll see what happens in the next year, but it's definitely moving in the right direction here. So it's very exciting.
I agree. And I think, just to answer your earlier question, Marissa, yes, we believe that this should absolutely extend to adults. There are examples of, and oftentimes when I say, no, this should be adults too, people say, oh, well, is that because there are mental limitations? Sometimes, but sometimes it's not.
Right.
Mentally
Right.
capable adults can give false confessions. This should absolutely extend.
Right. And there was kind of one more issue I wanted to hit on before we open to the Q&A for folks. And Dave, you had mentioned earlier the Mendez principles, which it came out, I think, earlier this year, if I'm not mistaken. Andy, I'm going to ask you to kind of tell us a little bit about what are the Mendez principles, and do they have, do you think, any kind of application to United States law enforcement in how we're trying to review how we run interrogations and interviews? I was looking at you, Andy.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the end of that? I do
Sure,
apologize. I
sure.
was trying to say that again.
And with the kind of picking up on what Dave had mentioned earlier about the Mendez principles, if you
Yes.
could just kind of explain to us what they are and whether you think that they have a role in some of the work that you're doing in the United States to reform interrogation principles.
Okay, so yeah, the Mendez principles. I mean, there was a global oversight group, which I was very fortunate to be invited to give some views on that. The importance of that is, again, of all the countries in the United Nations, they've signed up to the Mendez principles, and that's been a long road, which is an anti-torture road, basically, where people are agreeing essentially that coercion, whether it be physical bullying or psychological coercion, is wrong. So the Mendez principles are important from that point of view. Again, it's a leadership message. The practical issue with them is again this difficulty of the applicability in various countries depending on the justice system. So they are just that, principles, and there's going to be, I think, some training that comes out of the back of them. But it's very important the United Nations have made that statement, because for years the United Nations have been conducting prevention of torture inspections in countries and finding rubber hoses, batteries, pincers in police interrogation rooms. So, the Mendez principles are targeted at preventing mistreatment. They're ambitious in that they also try and advocate some techniques, but again, that is so difficult when you boil it down to each individual country system. But they're very important step for sure.
Okay, fair enough. And I want to kind of move to question and answer, and I will kind of leave this up for whoever wants to jump in, unless I direct it otherwise. And I just want to remind folks on the webinar that we will be moving to Instagram Live once we conclude the webinar. Rebecca and Dave in particular are going to be joining us for a follow-up discussion about how we're moving policies to prevent false confessions and prevent these kinds of injustices from occurring. But for right now, Rebecca, I think this one's aimed at you. I want to know the name of the bill in New York that has not gotten any traction. I'm hoping they're going to call their congressman to fix that.
Well, I can tell you it is Senate Bill 254, Senate Bill 324A, A for amended. And it was amended to also include young people, because when it was first introduced, it was only in adult court. So we were able to modify it. So that Senate Bill 324A. And for folks who are interested in supporting that legislation, if you come to our website, innocenceproject.org, you can sign up and get alerts about, if you're a New Yorker, at key points in time to call your lawmakers. So we appreciate the support.
And can you say that in that website one more time?
Sure. It's www.innocenceproject.org.
Great. And I think, Matt, this is probably more aimed at you. What are your questions on hypothetical? What are your thoughts, on hypothetical questions during an interview to require admissions from a suspect on a case with limited evidence? For example, if there had been video surveillance at the scene, what would it have shown? Is that?
Yeah, so this is a great question. We see the hypothetical evidence used a lot in interviews, especially towards the end of the interview, when the investigator is struggling, they can't get any progress in the interview, but especially in a lot of interviews where we have he said, she said type of incidents, sexual assaults, things like that, where there's no evidence at all. And this is a very tempting technique to use. It's been used by investigators for many years. We do have a few studies that have looked at the hypothetical question. And what we do know is that suspects will perceive this as actual evidence. And it's just as problematic as with false evidence ploys. So we do not teach hypothetical questions at all in our training, and we encourage people to really stay away from that. I realize they're very tempting, but the backside of that is the perception that the detective actually has real evidence is what's dangerous about that.
Andy, Dave, is that consistent with your training principles as well?
Absolutely, and generally, why are people asking hypothetical questions? Well, it's because they think they've got the guilty person in front of them. They might be right, but they might be wrong. And that it's linked to mindset. There was another question about further on down about, saying if there would have been CCTV at a crime scene, what would it have seen? Completely pointless. The other thing I would say is that also, and this is a sort of penny dropping moment sometimes for investigators. I do an exercise with people where we focus on the moment of a crime. When we charge someone with a crime, let's say it's a rape, it's the penetration that completes the crime. But detectives make the mistake of thinking that the key evidence is at that point. The key evidence might be the amount of drinks that the suspect was buying for the victim 3 hours before, or the way they isolated them from a group. So part of interviewing is not just about the moment of the crime, it's about the lead up and the conduct afterwards. Sometimes that circumstantial evidence can be enough. And when I've spoken to prosecutors in the US, they are interested in this, that instead of getting a confession for the act, the incriminated evidence in the run up and the afterwards could be enough. And so that's also part of a good interview strategy.
I think, Marissa, if I could add to that, there's a paper that we've been really relying on by Jen Perillo and Saul Casson, so two other incredible minds in this kind of industry. And the title might be wrong, but it was about, they called it the bluff, right? The lie and the bluff, and about the false evidence ploy. And I remember Dr. Casson telling a story where he was advocating against lying about evidence, and a detective in one of his seminars said, "Well, I don't lie, I bluff." And it was exactly what we're talking about here, was this hypothetical. And what was really interesting in their paper is they explained why innocent people are incentivized to confess when you give the false evidence ploy. And so, if you suggest, well, we do have DNA, or we will have video surveillance, the innocent person in that room then has faith that that evidence is real, or that you will eventually grab that evidence. So now if their mindset is, how do I get out of the room? If I just confess, it's fine, because the lawyers will figure it out. The DNA will prove I wasn't there. The video will prove I wasn't there, only to find out that there was no evidence in the first place. And all the investigator has is their confession. So it's really, like Matt said, it's an easy tactic to resort to when an investigator feels like they've hit a wall, when they don't recognize the danger of using something like that, how it incentivizes both an innocent person to falsely confess, and also potentially contaminates an actual true confession by giving up some details. So I think great points made by everybody on that piece.
Obviously affects the reliability of that statement and whether it can actually be used for investigative purposes, which is kind of going back to the initial issue. This is Andy, sorry, go right ahead.
Yeah, one more thing. Don't forget, when you're using a false evidence ploy, the one person who will suss it is the truly guilty person who does know the evidence. And that's what people tend to forget. If they very quickly realize that you are lying, then you're toast, because you have just ruined any tactic. And they're the people who have got the most to benefit, and it plays into their hands.
Okay. This is a pretty easy one, I think, and this is really more, I should think at all of the trainers. We've been talking a lot about local law enforcement. Have you been working with federal law enforcement, with FLETC or with any of the other federal agencies, and how receptive have they been, if you have?
I can go ahead and start off. So to answer that, yes, I've been working with a federal agency actually based out of FLETC, and the response has been overwhelming. First we started by getting their instructor staff through the training themselves, and then worked through the rest of the organization, and are now training not only the basic cadets, but also the ones out in the field. And this has been a real culture shift for them because they were stuck using a curriculum that was probably at least 60 years old. So the response has been very positive so far. We're working into our second year now, and we're really starting to see the culture shift because now we're starting to see them change the policy, their overall policy of how they were conducting interviews before and how they were treating these investigations. And it looks like we're going to have something good to report here hopefully soon.
Andy, Dave, if any of you work in federal law enforcement.
Go on, Dave.
Okay, I'm not going to repeat everything Matt said. Very similar concept. The one thing I'll add to that is in our success with federal agencies and our military partners and Department of Defense, we've actually seen the attendees over the last maybe decade or so, they're asking more questions. I think Andy made a comment earlier that the least experienced person was their best interviewer. We're also finding that those people are the most asking the most challenging questions in the class of, well, how do you know that to be true? And we're seeing throughout a program, because we're supporting everything with, here's the research that backs us, here's an example, that they're almost conditioned in the federal world and local, but they're more so we're seeing with federal agencies of, how do you know that to be true? What's the backing of that? Why does that make sense? So we're getting a more educated and challenging attendee, I think, in that atmosphere, which is great to see.
Sorry, I just lost it. I don't know this. So there's a question really about the impact of media and popular culture, that we see a lot of popular culture references and depictions of an interrogation room. I'll share with you, I'm a big fan of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. There's a whole episode called The Box with Sterling K. Brown, which is brilliant, except that every time I see it, I want to throw things at the screen because they're doing everything wrong. So they're really, I guess the question is whether there are any thoughts as to whether, is this an art, real life kind of situation, right? Does art imitate life, life imitate art? How do we change that if that is somewhat of a perception that we should be doing things the way I see it on Brooklyn Nine-Nine and not the way Matt Jones is trying to teach me how to do it?
Well, that was from Steve Kleiman, that question, actually, because I saw that come in. So Steve,
I wasn't going to out him, but you just did.
Yeah. And he compared it to smoking, which was a very astute, the fact you don't see smoking on TV anymore, a very astute observation. Well, but the trouble is, you see, that real interviewing is not sexy at all. And that's what we're up against. And it's the same. I'm sure if we spoke to doctors about medical series, the fact that complex things are oversimplified and portrayed wrongly. The trouble is, we maybe do have a generation that have trouble distinguishing fact from fiction. But on a serious and practical point, I speak to officers about it's really important that you deal with those issues when you start to interview people, because how do you know where that person is getting their baseline from, what they think of you? So regardless of whether TV adjusts or doesn't, and I don't think it will actually, it's important that investigators realize it is some people's reality, unfortunately.
I think on the flip, the positive side of this is Netflix and other groups have done an incredible job of highlighting everything that we're talking about right now. So, I in a seminar, if we ask somebody how many people have seen Making a Murderer or the confession tapes or whatever on Netflix, and more than half the room, their hand goes up, is I think we are getting a more educated juror, where people are more apt to understand that there are tactics being used that could result in a false confession where before they didn't maybe realize that existed. I think we're seeing in the courts in the US more acceptance of expert witness testimony as it regards to confession evidence because of that. So the CSIs and the NCIS shows are illustrating one point, but I think the true crime is another just takeoff. I mean, the Brendan Dassey case is something near and dear to my heart and really kind of introduced me into this world several years ago. And if we go back to put all this together, none of that would be happening right now if it wasn't video recorded. We wouldn't even have a chance to talk about Brendan Dassey's case. So I think the media portrayal of that has helped educate jurors and be more skeptical of the reliability of confessions.
I would agree with that too. I mean, I think it certainly cuts both ways. And I think oftentimes crime shows are not actually helpful and in fact, increase pressures in many ways, right? The CSI effect, this sense that every case is going to have this perfect amount of forensic evidence, which of course then puts a lot of pressure on the system to produce that. And so that can be very problematic. I do think, though, when you talk about a series like When They See Us, which depicted the Exonerated Five, the Central Park case, it was so educational. And I think on many levels, including the fact that Antron McCrae, one of the five, right, was depicted in the police agency as he was being interviewed, and his father came down, right, and basically encouraged him to confess. Now, he did that because he believed his son was going to get better treatment. He was trying to protect his son. But I think what it showed everyone was that, for instance, parents cannot take the place of counsel. And so I think that there are just many opportunities to educate. I think, unfortunately, it's sensationalistic oftentimes and does not help the system. But I do agree that when you're watching these documentaries in particular, or very well done depictions, they can be incredibly educational. And I think Ava DuVernay's series really changed the face of how people looked at this, as did Making of a Murderer. I mean, in my apartment building, a neighbor said to me, "Oh, I know you do this work. And I saw that film. And let me say, that was child abuse. It felt like I was watching child abuse." And so I really do think that, these can be incredibly edifying for people too.
Okay, and then just a few minutes, we're going to move the conversation. I'm going to ask Rebecca and Dave to join me on Instagram. But before we say goodbye to Matt and to Andy, first of all, gentlemen, my very sincere thanks. This is something I've been wanting to put together for so long. And so to have you both here has just been really tremendous for me. And I want to give you both a chance to kind of plug your work that you're doing. Andy, there was a request in the chat for your personal social media. I follow Andy on social media. Everybody should. He's brilliant and does kind of give a lot of elucidation on some of these topics through Twitter and others. So please feel free to follow him. Matt, I don't even know if you're on social media. If you are and you're ignoring me, that's cool. We're good. But just wanted to give you each an opportunity to kind of give a couple wrap-up thoughts before we have to say goodbye. Andy?
Yeah, I think that, I've referred to, other people have referred to the fact that other countries have done this first. And, in some ways, the US is held up as being behind the times. But there's an advantage in that, is that you don't have to go through some of the painful steps that other countries went through. You can snake and ladder it straight to the top. And, Matt's referred to the strong evidence base. The Higg has done a great job. Their research has essentially confirmed what the UK has been doing since 1992, but added some empirical rigor to it. Also, things have changed. When the UK did this, all we had was fingerprints and a bit of DNA. Now, the amount of digital evidence, DNA, and phone work you can get on investigations, there's a huge supporting investigative network that will back up solid investigation, and you will not see a drop-off in performance. So I think that's what I would say. It's a great time for the US to be doing this. The procedural justice thing, I never heard that talked about in the US 8 years ago when I was at John Jay lecturing. Ethics were never talked about. They are now, and it's important to people. And all of this fits with a procedural justice model, and it does deliver decent justice. So that's what I'd say is, and I'm happy to be helping. I think there's a lot that's great about the US system. This could make it better. ICATconsulting.com, if just to throw that out there. I'm Andy T. Griff on Twitter. So be delighted to see people following. But I look forward to working with everyone that we've been on with today. I've worked with you all in the past, look forward to doing it again. And this is a team effort. And that's one of the main things that I want to finish by saying. This all needs everyone to pull together, and the timing is right. But again, Marissa, I know how dedicated you've been to putting this together. Thanks for inviting me. It's been great. It's been a great hour and a half. Delighted.
Great. Thanks so much, Andy. Before, Matt, I give you your final word, I want to remind everybody that the last CLE password is recording. For those getting CLE credit, write down recording for your third. So Matt, thanks again for being with us, but I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, so I'm not going to plug the company right now just because we are inundated with requests for training. I'm actually thinking of taking the website down altogether because we're trying to keep up with the training requests. But I will say this, for the prosecutors that are on the webinar today, If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Marissa's got my contact information. I'd be more than happy to talk with you and hopefully get more of you involved. One of the things that I really stress about the training that we do with our company is we are bringing the researchers into the training environment. We are bringing them into the room to be involved with the training for the investigators. And this is the biggest component that I think was really missing, is having this input from the researchers about what is actually going on out there. And the investigators, they absolutely love it. And it's great to be able to collaborate with them. I would not want to do these trainings without the researchers. And this is something that I feel brings a lot of value to these curriculums moving forward. So with that being said, thank you so much for inviting me today. It's been a pleasure.
Great. And thank you so much, Matt. And again, thank you, Andy. For those who are going to be joining us over on Instagram, so head over to Instagram. You can go to @Quattrone Center. That's @QUATTRONECENTER, all one word, for a live Q&A. Rebecca and Dave will be joining us over there. So we'll see you on Instagram. We will be posting a recording of the webinar on the Quattrone Center's YouTube channel, which has a URL that's way too long for me to say right now, but just look for us on YouTube and you'll be able to find this recording. So thank you, everybody. Again, thank you to all the panelists, and Rebecca and Dave. I'll see you over on Instagram.
Thank you.
Thanks.